Chapter 24. The Final Showdown. Part 5. The echoes of the disciples' molten body receding into the darkened streets left the group a moment to regroup, but it was painfully clear that Wallace could no longer continue. Blood seeped through the bandages hastily applied earlier, staining his tattered uniform. His breathing was labored, his strength dwindling, yet his sharp eyes burned with determination. Mina knelt beside him, her usually confident demeanor shadowed by concern. "Wallace, you can't push through this. You've done more than enough," she said, her voice steady but soft. Wallace coughed, shaking his head. "It's not about what I've done, Mina. It's about what I haven't. That thing is still out there, and you all need every fighter you can get." "You staying here is fighting," Mina countered, her tone firmer now. "We need someone to rally the militia and keep them from scattering. They'll listen to you. But you won't help anyone if you're dead." Lucas, pale and visibly drained, leaned against Thomas for support. He glanced at Wallace through tired eyes and added telepathically, "You've done your part, Wallace. We'll finish this." Wallace's jaw tightened, his pride at war with the reality of his injuries. After a long pause, he nodded. "Fine. But you better make it count." Mina wasted no time. She turned to a group of militia fighters nearby, still trembling from their earlier encounter with the disciple. "You two, stay with Wallace. Guard him with your lives and make sure he gets patched up properly." Her voice carried an edge that brooked no argument. The militia members saluted nervously and rushed to help Wallace, lifting him onto a makeshift stretcher. Despite his weakened state, Wallace managed a faint smile as he looked at Mina. "You're a good leader when you want to be." Mina didn't reply, though her jaw clenched slightly. She turned back to the others. Lucas struggled to straighten himself, summoning every ounce of resolve he had left. "We need a new plan. No more fire and water tricks. We won't catch the disciple off guard with the same tactic twice." Thomas stepped closer, his imposing frame solid and reassuring. "Then what? We're running out of options, and you're barely standing." "I'll manage," Lucas said, though his voice wavered. "This has to be a coordinated attack. Mina, you're fast enough to keep it distracted and wear it down. Thomas, we need your strength to deliver heavy hits at the right moment. I'll guide you both telepathically and provide support when the moment's right." Thomas crossed his arms, skepticism evident. "And what happens when you collapse again? We can't afford to lose you." Mina interjected, her tone decisive. "We don't have time for doubts. Lucas has a plan, and we stick to it. That thing's not invincible, but it's not going to wait for us to be ready. We move now." Her words ignited a spark of determination in the group. Lucas nodded weakly, appreciating her decisiveness, while Thomas adjusted his grip on his shield. As the group prepared to move, Wallace called out, his voice strained but resolute. "Mina, Lucas, Thomas, you take that thing down, no matter what it takes." Mina glanced back at him, her green eyes fierce. "We will. Stay alive, Wallace." With that, the group set off into the battle-scarred streets, leaving Wallace behind with the militia. The echoes of their footsteps faded into the distance, a reminder that their fight was far from over. The group moved through the rubble-strewn streets, their pace steady despite the exhaustion etched into their faces. Every corner they turned felt heavy with anticipation, the weight of their mission pressing down on their shoulders. The disciples' molten glow flickered in the distance, a burning beacon of danger and defiance. Lucas stumbled, catching himself against a wall. His breaths were shallow, his body trembling from the effort of keeping upright. Mina slowed her pace to look back at him, concern flashing in her eyes. "Lucas, if you can't," she started. "I can," Lucas interrupted, his voice resolute despite his obvious fatigue. "This is ending here, one way or another." Thomas adjusted his shield, his broad frame a protective wall beside Lucas. "We have your back. Just say the word." Lucas nodded, focusing his mind. He reached out telepathically to both Mina and Thomas, weaving a mental strategy as they closed the distance to their enemy. "Mina, keep it moving. Use your speed to disorient it. Make it overreach. Thomas, hit hard when there's an opening. I'll finish this." The disciple turned as they approached, its molten, warped body glowing brighter in the dim light of the city. It let out a deep, guttural sound, a vibration that rattled through the air like a threat. Mina wasted no time. She darted forward, her movements a blur of agility and precision. The disciple swung its massive, molten arm toward her, but she was already gone, skidding to a stop behind it and striking its knee joint with a powerful kick. The impact sent a sharp crack through the air, though the disciple remained steady. It spun, lava spraying from its damaged joint, but Mina danced out of reach, keeping its focus on her. Thomas seized the distraction. With a roar, he charged, slamming his shield into the disciple's side. The blow forced the creature to stagger, its balance faltering. Now Lucas sent to Mina and Thomas. Drawing on the last reserves of his strength, Lucas reached out with his telekinesis. A jagged metal pole buried in the debris nearby quivered, then lifted into the air. His focus narrowed, every ounce of his power concentrated on driving the pole forward. "Mina, move!" Lucas yelled aloud, his voice hoarse from exertion. Mina leapt clear just as the disciple swung at her again, exposing its core, a swirling, molten heart of energy encased in a glowing obsidian-like shell. With a final, desperate push, Lucas sent the metal pole hurtling toward the disciple. It pierced through the creature's core, blinding burst of heat and light erupting from the impact. The disciple let out a thunderous, otherworldly roar, its body convulsing violently. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over. The disciple's movements slowed, its glow dimming as cracks spread from its core. But it didn't fall. The creature stood, its molten form still flickering with faint light. The damage was severe, its core fractured and its movements sluggish, yet it remained upright, defiant. Lucas collapsed to his knees, completely spent. His vision blurred as he tried to steady his breathing. "It's not down yet," Thomas muttered, tightening his grip on his sword. "No," Mina said, stepping forward, her voice firm. "But it's not going anywhere, either." The disciple took a lumbering step forward, its molten limbs sparking as they struggled to hold their shape. It let out another guttural roar, but the sound was weaker this time, a signal of desperation rather than dominance. Mina glanced at Lucas, then at Thomas. "We've got this," she said, her tone resolute. "It's just a matter of time now." Thomas nodded, stepping in front of Lucas protectively. Mina advanced, her green eyes locked on the disciple as the battle neared its final act. The streets had become a battlefield, cracked, scorched, and trembling with the aftershocks of their fight. Lucas, drained of all his strength, lay motionless on the ground, his body sprawled in the wreckage, his breath shallow but steady. His mind was consumed by darkness, the last vestiges of his telepathic connection fading as he succumbed to unconsciousness. Mina's heart raced as she approached the disciple again, her eyes locked on the fractured core, glowing weakly but still pulsing with dangerous life. The creature staggered under its own weight, its molten limbs flickering erratically. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Mina felt her adrenaline surge as she moved forward, her movements swift and determined. The damage to the disciple's core was significant, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. She leapt into action, her legs sweeping out in a wide arc, striking one of the creature's remaining arms. The impact sent chunks of molten rock scattering, but the disciple retaliated with a sudden movement, its fiery fist connecting with Mina's side. She grunted in pain, stumbling back, but refused to retreat. She shot a look toward Lucas, then back to the disciple. She had to end this. But her recklessness proved costly. The disciple, driven by desperation, swiped its other arm toward her. Mina dodged the first strike, but was caught by the second, her body flying into the debris. Her head slammed into a pile of shattered stone, and her vision went dark. "Mina!" Thomas's voice tore through the air, but she couldn't respond. The disciple seemed to savor the brief victory, raising its molten arm for the final strike. But Thomas wasn't about to let that happen. With a primal roar, Thomas surged forward, his eyes burning with determination. He grabbed a long, thick piece of metal, broken from the remains of a nearby structure, and swung it into his hands. The jagged end created an improvised mace, and he wielded it with brutal force. "Enough!" he shouted. In one swift, ferocious motion, Thomas swung the mace overhead and smashed it into the remaining pole impaled in the disciple's core. The impact sent a ripple through the creature's body. The pole sunk deeper into its heart, the cracks in the disciple's core widening with an explosive groan. The ground itself seemed to shake as the immense energy contained within the disciple's body began to unravel. There was a moment of silence, a breathless pause as the earth trembled beneath them. And then the explosion of force erupted, an earth-shattering quake that seemed to crack the very foundations of the city. The molten body of the disciple crumbled, the intense heat evaporating into a wave of steam, and the core shattered, sending out violent tremors that toppled nearby buildings. The city around them seemed to collapse in slow motion, walls of stone crumbling, streets splitting open, and debris raining down in every direction. The disciple, once a towering terror, was now nothing more than a heap of fractured stone and molten slag, its power extinguished in a deafening roar. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, the shock of the destruction surrounding him washing over him. The ground beneath his feet continued to shake, buildings cracking and groaning, their structures no longer able to withstand the tumult. He glanced around, his heart racing as the dust settled and the echoes of the battle reverberated through the ruined streets. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Thomas spotted Wallace, still alive but badly wounded. He hurried to his side, helping him to his feet, his muscles aching with the effort. Then his eyes turned to Lucas. The young man was sprawled on the ground, his body still, but his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Mina lay unconscious, her body battered, the blood from a gash on her forehead slowly staining the ground. A grim silence settled over the wreckage, broken only by the distant sounds of buildings falling and the occasional rumble of aftershocks. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and looked back at the ruined cityscape. His hands were trembling as he surveyed the destruction, the consequence of their victory. The streets were no longer safe, the once thriving city reduced to rubble. But in the aftermath, he could see one thing clearly. They had won. The disciple was no more. But at what cost? His thoughts raced as he turned back to his friends. They were still alive, still breathing, but their injuries were grave. The battle had taken everything from them, and now it was up to him to keep them safe. He kneeled beside Lucas, checking for any signs of further harm. His chest tightened at the sight of Lucas's unconscious form, but there was nothing else he could do for him in this moment. His gaze shifted to Mina and then to Wallace. He wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. Their journey wasn't over yet, and the cost of their victory had only just begun to sink in.